Hi guys, how are you today? In the stillness of this moment, let us take a quiet journey together. Imagine yourself for a time stepping into a world far from our own, into a time when life moved slower, when each day was marked by routine, and when the whisper of history floated gently through the air. A world where the sun rose and set with the rhythm of the seasons, and the smallest moments held meaning. If you're as excited as we are to dive into this captivating journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more adventures into the past. Let's uncover the mysteries of the Middle Ages together. Hit that bell icon too, so you're always first in line for the next historical adventure. As we settle into this peaceful space, let the noises of today fade into the background. Feel the weight of the modern world lighten, and allow your mind to wander back, far back, into the distant past. Picture the landscape of the medieval ages, where every action, every glance, and every gesture was charged with silent purpose, though few would ever speak of it aloud. Today we'll explore a story, quiet, yet filled with hidden significance, about a noblewoman. A woman whose life was dictated by the expectations of her birth, bound by the rules of her society, yet driven by something deeper, something more personal. Today we'll explore the question of what might have happened if such a noblewoman had an affair, quietly defying the rigid structure of her world. In the medieval world, life was different. Time itself seemed to move in a slower rhythm, marked by the seasons, the harvests, and the passing of days that felt similar to the last. The Middle Ages, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, were defined by a deep sense of order and hierarchy. In this world, noblewomen lived in a realm of expectation, a realm where their lives were intricately tied to family and fortune, to the land they inhabited, and the alliances they forged. Marriage, for a noblewoman, was never a matter of personal choice. It was a contract, a strategic alliance between families, often arranged by fathers or other male figures long before the woman herself had any say in the matter. The aim was to secure wealth, land and power. Personal affection or emotional connection was a secondary concern, a mere afterthought in the grand scheme of things. A noblewoman's life was one of regulation. She spent her days managing her household, overseeing servants, ensuring that the estate functioned smoothly. She might have found some solace in the beauty of her surroundings, the gardens, the tapestries, the quiet solitude of her chambers. But all of this came with the unspoken rule. She was the embodiment of her family's honor. Every action, every word she spoke, was weighed against this invisible standard. In such a world, there was little room for personal freedom, for love to emerge in a way that could be truly her own. And yet, even within these constraints, there remained a quiet space for desire, hidden, soft, and sometimes forbidden. To understand the position of a noblewoman, it is essential to grasp the nature of her marriage. In medieval society, a noblewoman's marriage was a transaction. She was often married to a man chosen by her family, someone who would secure their political and economic future. She may have met her husband only briefly before the wedding, perhaps during an arranged meeting or a formal dinner. For the noblewoman, the wedding day was not one of personal joy, but of duty. She was expected to produce heirs, sons who would carry on the family name, daughters who would be married off in turn, securing further alliances. Her own desires were often an afterthought. What mattered was how well she managed her home, how efficiently she managed her children's upbringing, and how well she presented the outward appearance of a perfect marriage. In the confines of her marriage, there was little space for the individual. The woman's desires, her wants, her inner thoughts were often stifled, compressed into a role that she could not escape. And so, in this context, it is easy to understand how a noblewoman might find herself looking for something more. As we slowly bring this story to a close, we leave the noblewoman of the medieval world in the silence of her private thoughts. Her life, like the world around her, moved slowly. And though the world may have been rigid and structured, there was always room for the quiet stirrings of desire and connection, no matter how carefully they had to be hidden. In the calm of this moment, let us reflect on how such hidden moments shape the larger story of life in the medieval world. For even in times of strict order, the human spirit found ways to speak softly, to make itself known. May the quiet beauty of these long-forgotten moments remain with you as you drift into your own thoughts, leaving behind the world of today and wandering into the restful silence of the past. The medieval world was one of contrasts. While the seasons moved slowly, the changes in power and land were sharp, shifting quickly under the hands of kings and lords. But for noblewomen, life was defined by a constant rhythm: marriage, motherhood, and the unspoken expectations of managing their family's name. In the 12th to 15th centuries, the noblewoman's role was clear, yet limiting. The concept of nobility was rooted in the preservation of family honour and the accumulation of wealth and land. A noblewoman was not seen as an individual, but as part of a larger structure. Her primary role was to secure the future of her family through marriage, motherhood, and her duties as the keeper of her household. Marriage was not a choice, but a contract. Often, she would marry a man chosen by her father or family, a man who would help advance the family's status or wealth. For her, love was rarely a consideration. What mattered was how well she fulfilled her role in the family's continuing success. Her personal feelings, desires, or emotional inclinations were secondary to the needs of the estate. This world, one of quiet obligation and rigid expectations, is the foundation of a noble woman's existence.
Here, in these carefully constructed spaces, she would spend her days, often with little more than an illusion of control over her own life.
To understand the role of a noblewoman, it is important to first explore the institution of marriage. In this world, a noblewoman's marriage was far from a personal affair. It was a strategic decision made by her family, often when she was still a girl. The man she would marry was carefully chosen, sometimes for his land, his wealth, or his power, sometimes simply because he was the right match to preserve the family's legacy. Her marriage was not a place for personal joy, but a foundation for family continuity. She was expected to bear children, especially male heirs, to carry on the family name. In this way, her role as a wife was firmly tied to her duty as a mother. It was understood that she would nurture, guide, and shape the future generation. Her own desires, her own hopes for love or connection, were often suppressed by the weight of her responsibilities. As a wife, a noblewoman's position was firmly defined. She had the care of the household, supervising servants, managing finances, and overseeing the day-to-day operations of the estate. While she might have had some influence over how the home was run, her life was largely shaped by the decisions of her husband and later, her sons. It was a life of service, though her service was one of comfort and privilege compared to the lives of those beneath her. Within the walls of her home, a noblewoman's duties were many. She was the heart of the household, responsible for its smooth operation. This included overseeing the servants and other staff, managing the estate's finances, and ensuring that her children were properly educated. The day-to-day responsibilities could be mundane, yet they were vital for the family's continued prosperity. The household was a small world in itself, a world of kitchens and hearths, of servants and courtiers, of quiet dinners and the hush of nightly prayers. A noblewoman would find her time consumed by the many demands of her family, and yet the role she played within this environment was not one of true power or autonomy. Her authority was limited by the boundaries of her gender and social position. She could make decisions, but they would always be influenced by the will of the men in her life, her father, her husband, or her sons. The noblewoman's world was often a quiet one. Much of the household's work happened behind closed doors. She might have found comfort in the careful rhythms of her days, dinners, gatherings, and walks in the garden. But these moments were always tinged with the awareness that they were meant to preserve the family's standing. Throughout her life, a noblewoman was expected to embody virtue. In a world where honour was everything, her actions were scrutinised at every turn. The way she spoke, the way she dressed, and the way she carried herself. Everything was tied to her role in preserving the family's reputation. Her beauty, her grace, and her demeanour were not just personal qualities, but qualities that reflected on her family's status. There was little room for imperfection, for flaws, or for desires that did not fit within the mould of what society demanded. Noblewomen were often portrayed as the epitome of virtue, quiet, humble, and composed. These ideals were drilled into them from a young age, and they carried them with them throughout their lives. The pressure to maintain this image could be overwhelming, yet it was an unspoken expectation that guided every action they took. As we consider the life of a noblewoman in medieval society, we begin to see the constraints that defined her world. Her role was clear, yet her freedom was limited. She lived in a world where her personal desires were often irrelevant to the grand scheme of things. Her marriage, her duties, and her place in the family's lineage defined her existence. And yet, in the quiet spaces of her life, there was always room for something more. The everyday moments, managing the household, guiding her children, tending to her garden, were small acts of autonomy, of self-expression, even within the rigid boundaries of her role. These were the moments that defined her not as a passive figure, but as a woman who navigated the expectations placed upon her in her own quiet, steady way. Her life was shaped by the rules of society, but it was also shaped by the small choices she made in the spaces she could control. In her own way, she carved out a sense of meaning, even as she upheld the legacy of her family. In the stillness of this moment, we can see her not just as a figure bound by expectations, but as a woman who, even in a world of constraint, found small ways to assert herself. And so, as we leave this world of medieval nobility behind, we are reminded of the quiet resilience found in the smallest moments of daily life. May these gentle reflections carry with you, bringing a sense of calm as we continue our journey through time. The concept of an affair in medieval society was not the same as we might think of today. The medieval world was one of clear divisions, noble and commoner, rich and poor, man and woman. Marriages were not viewed as unions of love, but as alliances that strengthened families, securing power, land, and wealth. For noblewomen, marriage was a duty, a way to preserve the family's name and ensure the next generation. Personal affection was seldom considered, and romantic love was often relegated to the background. In this world, an affair was not just a breach of trust, but a serious transgression. It was not only about the infidelity itself, but about the public disgrace that could follow. For noblewomen, their honour was their currency, and anything that threatened this honour, whether through a whispered rumour or an illicit relationship, could lead to disgrace and ruin. Yet, despite these risks, affairs, secret liaisons, and quiet romances still flourished in the shadows. An affair in this context was not one marked by passion or drama, but by silence and secrecy. These relationships were hidden beneath layers of societal expectations and often took place in quiet corners, away from prying eyes. They were not the wild, dramatic love stories we often imagine, but were instead subtle, quiet, and at times almost imperceptible. In a world so bound by duty and order, the desire for something more, something personal, something for oneself, could not easily be ignored. For a noblewoman, the constraints of marriage, the pressure to uphold family honour, and the demands of motherhood and household management created a life that, while privileged, could also feel isolating and lonely. An affair in this context would have been more than just a physical act. It would have been a way for the noblewoman to experience something outside the boundaries of her role, a space where she could feel desired and human, rather than just a vessel for her family's legacy. Yet, these desires could not be fulfilled in the open. The affair had to be hidden, often behind the walls of the castle, or in the privacy of her chambers, away from the watchful eyes of others. Such relationships, though intimate in nature, would have been marked by a quiet tension. The noblewoman would have lived in constant awareness that any misstep, any hint of her actions being discovered, could bring ruin. The relationship would have existed in the smallest of moments, the briefest of glances, a hand lightly brushing against hers, a whispered word in a secluded corner of the garden. To understand the affair of a noblewoman, we must consider the spaces where these moments of intimacy would have unfolded. The medieval world was full of secluded, private areas where such relationships could take shape. Hidden gardens, dimly lit corridors, and private chambers. These spaces were not just physical locations, but emotional sanctuaries, places where a noblewoman could, for just a few moments, step outside her prescribed role and find something personal, something for herself. A castle, with its labyrinth of rooms and hallways, would have been the perfect setting for such a quiet affair. The noblewoman might meet her lover under the guise of a casual stroll in the garden, or perhaps a late-night meeting in a forgotten library, away from the public eye. These meetings were not marked by passion, but by a slow, steady pull toward connection. Each moment spent together would have been brief, fleeting, and always under the weight of secrecy. The affair itself, then, was a kind of emotional dance. It was not about dramatic gestures, but about the small exchanges, the touch of a hand, a glance shared in silence, a conversation carried out in whispers. These moments were as much about the unspoken connection between the two people as they were about the physical act itself. As we consider the noblewoman's affair, we must also reflect on the weight of guilt that would have accompanied such a relationship. In a world where honor and reputation were everything, the idea of betrayal, of breaking the rules that govern society, would have been a source of constant tension. Her life was a double one. In public, she was the epitome of virtue, a woman who upheld the ideals of marriage, motherhood, and propriety. But in the private spaces of the castle, in the stillness of the night, she was someone else, a woman with desires, with needs, with a secret life that could never be known. This internal conflict would have been constant, a silent undercurrent in her daily existence. The guilt would have been a quiet, persistent companion, always lurking in the background. It would not have been expressed through loud gestures or dramatic moments, but through the soft tension in her movements, the careful words she spoke, the wary glances she cast. It was a kind of emotional weight, one that she carried alone in silence. As we reflect on the idea of an affair in the medieval world, we begin to see the complexity of human desire and the ways in which it could be suppressed, hidden, and expressed in the smallest of moments. An affair was not an open rebellion, but a quiet act of resistance, a way to assert some small measure of autonomy in a world that sought to define every aspect of one's life. It was not a relationship marked by dramatic gestures, but by the subtlety of everyday actions, the light touch, the stolen glance, the whispered word. These were the moments that defined the affair, the moments that gave it meaning. And yet, these very moments were also marked by the constant awareness of risk and the threat of discovery. In the end, the affair was a quiet rebellion against the rigid constraints of society, a space where a noblewoman could briefly escape her prescribed role, finding solace in secret desires, even as she carried the weight of guilt and secrecy. In the end, the affair was a quiet rebellion against the rigid constraints of society, a space where a noblewoman could briefly escape her prescribed role, finding solace in secret desires, even as she carried the weight of guilt and secrecy. Life in the medieval world was far from fast-paced. The rhythms of the day were dictated by the seasons, the harvest, the rise and fall of the sun. Noblewomen, despite the grandeur of their estates, lived lives marked by repetitive patterns and a sense of timelessness. They woke with the light, attended to their duties, and retired with the dark. While the world outside the walls of their castles was filled with strife and movement, their lives followed a steady, predictable course. Within these confines, a noblewoman's world was both expansive and limited. On the one hand, she enjoyed privileges not afforded to most others: wealth, fine clothes, beautiful homes, and leisure time. But on the other, she was bound by the duties of managing the household, bearing children, and maintaining the family's honor. Her day-to-day life was full of these responsibilities, each task layered with a sense of duty and order. Yet, in the quiet spaces of her routine, there was room for something else, a secret world, hidden away beneath the surface of her outward life. This world was not one of excitement or drama, but one of small, subtle moments that carried with them a certain depth. These moments, though private, shaped her existence in ways both delicate and profound. A noblewoman's day would begin early, with the rising sun and the soft sounds of the castle waking around her. Her servants would prepare her room, lighting a small fire in the hearth, drawing back the heavy curtains to let in the light, and setting out the first of her daily necessities: her gown, her mirror, and perhaps a bowl of water to wash her face. As she awoke, there would be no rush, no frantic need to begin the day. Everything happened in its own time, as it always had. She would rise slowly, perhaps gazing out the window at the gardens below, taking a moment to herself before the demands of the day began. The morning hours were often spent in solitude, or in the quiet company of the women who served her. There would be no haste in her movements, only a steady rhythm. As she dressed, she would have a small moment to reflect, to gather her thoughts before the day fully began. It was during this time, before the estate began to stir with activity, that the noblewoman might have experienced a moment of stillness, a brief silence that contrasted with the expectations of her life. She might have thought of her secret meetings, of the quiet moments shared with someone she could not name. And yet, even in these brief moments of reflection, she would know that duty awaited her. By midday, the duties of the household would demand her attention. Her role as the mistress of the estate was central to the functioning of the castle. The management of servants, the organization of supplies, and the preparation of meals, all these tasks would fall within her purview. The rhythm of these tasks was gentle but steady. It was in the small, everyday activities, organizing the kitchen, overseeing the planning of the harvest, or ensuring the care of the children, that the noblewoman found herself immersed. There was a quiet satisfaction in seeing the estate run smoothly, in ensuring that each task was completed with care and attention to detail. But even in the midst of these everyday tasks, the noblewoman would carry within her the knowledge of her secret. Perhaps, as she walked the halls of the castle or moved through the garden, she would find herself glancing over her shoulder, wondering if anyone knew. The weight of secrecy would be ever present, though it would not interrupt the flow of her daily work. The rhythm of life continued, soft and steady, with small moments of reflection tucked into the edges of each hour. As the day drew to a close, the noblewoman would retire for the evening, once again slipping into the privacy of her chambers. The evening was a time for relaxation, but it was also a time for contemplation. After the bustle of the day, the house grew quiet, and she would have moments of peace to herself. During these hours, the noblewoman might have reflected on her day, on the conversations she had, the responsibilities she met, and, perhaps, the fleeting moments of intimacy she shared with her secret lover. These moments were small, like the quiet trickle of water down a stream, easily overlooked, yet deeply felt. In the privacy of her chambers, she would have the time to consider the complexities of her life, the duties of her marriage, the expectations of her family, and the quiet rebellion of her affair. These thoughts, though never shared, would form a constant, unspoken narrative in her life. They would weave together in the corners of her mind, adding layers to the otherwise simple routine of her day. As we consider the noblewoman's life amid secrecy, we are reminded of the quiet rhythms that shaped her existence. Life, in its most ordinary form, was often marked by repetition. The morning would lead to the afternoon to the evening, and so on, each day following the next with little variation. Yet, within this structure, there were small, hidden moments that, though soft and fleeting, held a deep significance. The quiet exchanges, the stolen glances, the moments of reflection. They were all part of the noblewoman's secret life, a life that ran parallel to the public world she inhabited. Her existence was one of balance, between the public duties of her role and the private desires she carried. These desires, though hidden, shaped her world in subtle ways. They were not marked by dramatic gestures or loud rebellion, but by quiet, almost imperceptible acts of defiance. In this world of stillness, the noblewoman found her own way to navigate the complexities of her life. She did not live in the grand moments of passion or excitement, but in the small spaces between them, the spaces where the everyday and the extraordinary met. Medieval society was built on the foundation of honor and reputation. These were not just abstract ideals, but the very currency by which people were valued. For a noblewoman, her reputation was tied to her family's honor, and anything that might threaten this, be it a whisper of scandal or a misstep in her personal conduct, could have far-reaching effects. In a world where lineage was everything, the noblewoman's role was to uphold her family's legacy, both through her marriage and her children. Marriages were not based on love, but on alliances and security, and infidelity was seen as a breach not just of personal vows, but of the very foundation of her family's social standing. Though many affairs in the medieval world went unnoticed or unspoken, the threat of exposure always loomed. A noblewoman caught in an affair faced more than just the personal consequences of betrayal. She would face public disgrace, potential disinheritance, and even exile. The mere suggestion of dishonor could tarnish the name of her family for generations. Yet despite the severe consequences, affairs continued to exist in the quiet corners of the noblewoman's life. Perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, it was the secrecy, rather than the affair itself, that became the most significant consequence. While an affair was, in some ways, a personal act, its consequences were far from private. In medieval society, reputation was not something one could protect alone. It was tied to the collective honor of the family. If the affair were to be discovered, it would not only affect the woman involved, but would ripple through her entire family, threatening their place in society. The public disgrace that would follow an affair could be quiet and insidious, like a whisper in a crowded room. It would not necessarily come with loud outbursts or accusations, but it would quietly stain the reputation of the woman involved. The gentle, unspoken judgment of society would begin to seep into every interaction, every social event, and every moment spent in public. For the noblewoman, the loss of respect would not come in dramatic waves. Instead, it would slowly alter the way others saw her, subtle shifts in behavior, in the way people looked at her, in the way conversations might fall silent when she entered a room. The shame would not be visible to all, but it would be enough to remind her of the fragile nature of her position in society. Her life would continue, but it would be marked by this quiet shift, a reminder that her actions, no matter how private they seemed, were never truly hidden from the watchful eyes of the world. Beyond the public consequences, there was also the emotional toll that would accompany the discovery of an affair. For the noble woman, the guilt of betrayal would not be sudden, but a constant presence in her life. It would follow her quietly, like a shadow that never quite left. The guilt would be subtle, woven into the fabric of her everyday routine. It would appear in the way she interacted with her husband, with her children, with the servants who looked to her for guidance. She would not show her guilt in grand displays, but it would be there in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she thought. Even in the private moments of reflection, the guilt would linger. There would be no grand confession, no dramatic outpouring of emotion. Instead, the guilt would be carried silently, tucked away in the recesses of her mind, never spoken aloud, but always present, shaping her every action. Another consequence of an affair was the possibility of isolation. In a world where reputation was everything, the noblewoman might find herself distanced from others, either through her own choice or through the natural distancing of society. If the affair were to be discovered, she might be shunned by those around her, as friends and allies retreated from the shadow of scandal. The isolation would not come with sharp words or cruel rejection, but with subtle distance. It would be the absence of invitations, the coolness of once warm interactions, the silence in conversations that once flowed easily. The noblewoman might find herself spending more time in her chambers, alone with her thoughts, as the world outside her walls slowly became a place she no longer felt welcome. Yet, in the quiet of her solitude, she might also find a sense of peace. The absence of external judgment might offer her a brief respite from the relentless pressure of society's expectations. In her isolation, she could retreat from the world and reflect, though the guilt of her actions would always be present, even in the stillness of her solitude. As we consider the consequences of an affair, we see how they unfold slowly, quietly, and often without fanfare. The world of the noble woman was one of subtle judgment and quiet retribution. The consequences of her actions would not come with loud public declarations, but with the soft, unspoken awareness that her reputation had been changed forever. The emotional toll was no less significant. The guilt, the sense of isolation, and the quiet shame would all weigh heavily on her heart. Yet, it is important to remember that these consequences, though real and felt deeply, were not always externalized in dramatic ways. Instead, they became part of the quiet rhythm of her life, ever present, but never fully acknowledged. The affair was not just a personal transgression, but a shift in the delicate balance of power, reputation, and self-worth. And in this world, where the public and private lives were so intricately tied, the consequences were never just confined to the individual, but were shared, often silently, with the wider world. Throughout our time together, we have glimpsed the world of a medieval noblewoman, a world marked by order, expectation, and the delicate balance between personal desires and public duties. Her life was shaped by a marriage that was more of a contract than a union of hearts, by responsibilities that weighed heavily upon her, and by the constant presence of societal pressure to uphold her family's honour. In this world, the personal and the public were never separate. A noblewoman's actions were always scrutinized, not just by those around her, but by the world itself. And yet, within this world of order, there was room for something softer, something more intimate, a secret life that unfolded in quiet corners, away from prying eyes. This life, though brief and hidden, carried with it the weight of human desire, of longing for connection, and of the need to be seen as more than just a symbol of her family's name. Her affair, though never loudly declared, spoke to the complexity of her inner world. It was not an act of rebellion in the way we might think of rebellion today. It was, instead, a subtle form of self-expression, a way to experience something beyond the confines of her role, a brief moment of personal freedom. But even this small act carried consequences, ones that echoed softly through her life. As we conclude our exploration of the noblewoman's life, we are left with a sense of quiet reflection. Her world, though shaped by rules and expectations, was also shaped by the small, hidden spaces where her desires could take root. These spaces, though often unseen, were no less real, and they carried with them a quiet power. May the stillness of her story offer you a sense of peace as we gently move forward. History, like life, is made up not only of grand events, but of the small, quiet moments that linger in the background. It is in these moments that we find the true complexity of the human experience, and it is in these moments that we learn about the power of silence, secrecy, and the quiet assertion of our own selves. Let us carry these reflections with us as we continue to move through the world, always aware of the subtle forces that shape our lives, even when they are hidden from view. Thank you for joining us. Rest well, take care of your beautiful self, whatever that means to you, and until next time. Good night.